Steve Harvey had stood behind the Family Feud podium for over 14 years, and during that time, he had heard countless stories from contestants about their lives, their families, and their dreams. He had shared laughs with people who brought infectious joy to the stage, offered encouragement to nervous players who needed confidence, and witnessed moments of genuine emotion that reminded him why human connection mattered more than any game. But on this mild March afternoon in 2025, as he welcomed two families onto the stage for what he expected to be another entertaining episode, Steve had no idea he was about to meet someone whose story would break his heart so completely that he would struggle to maintain his professional composure. What began as a typical Family Feud taping would transform into one of the most emotionally powerful moments in television history, a testament to love that transcends death and the unbreakable bonds between parent and child. Before we explore this profoundly moving story of loss, love, and the courage it takes to keep living when your reason for living is gone, if you believe in honoring the memories of those we have lost by sharing their stories, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these powerful reminders of what truly matters in life. The Peterson family from Minneapolis, Minnesota, stood ready to compete, and leading them was 62-year-old Robert Peterson. Robert carried himself with quiet dignity, a tall man whose silver hair and kind eyes gave him the appearance of someone who had lived through both joy and sorrow and had emerged with wisdom and grace. Standing beside Robert were his sister Margaret, his brother-in-law Carl, his nephew David, and his longtime friend and neighbor Helen, who Robert introduced as family in every way that mattered. The group had a gentle, supportive energy that made them immediately likable, the kind of family unit that reminded viewers why shows like Family Feud mattered, because they celebrated the connections between people who showed up for each other through life's challenges. What nobody in the studio knew, what Robert had chosen not to mention in his application or pre-interview conversations, was that the reason he was on this stage had everything to do with a promise he had made to someone who was no longer alive, someone whose absence shaped every moment of Robert's existence. Robert Peterson had been married to his wife Catherine for 38 years, a marriage that had been built on friendship, mutual respect, and a love that deepened with each passing year. They had met in college, married young, and built a life together in Minneapolis where Robert worked as a high school math teacher and Catherine worked as a pediatric nurse. Their marriage had been blessed with one child, a daughter named Emma, who had been the absolute center of their world from the moment she was born. Emma had inherited her mother's compassion and her father's analytical mind, growing into a remarkable young woman who brought joy and purpose to everything she touched. She had excelled in school, earned a scholarship to medical school, and was in her final year of residency in pediatric oncology when tragedy struck in the most unexpected and devastating way. 3 years earlier, Emma had been driving home from the hospital after completing a particularly difficult shift in which she had lost a young patient she had been treating for months. The emotional weight of that loss, combined with exhaustion from working a 30-hour shift, had made Emma slower to react when a driver ran a red light and crashed into her car at an intersection just blocks from her apartment. Emma had been rushed to the hospital where she worked, where her colleagues and mentors had fought desperately to save her life, but the injuries from the accident were too severe. Emma had died 6 hours after the crash, at 29 years old, with her entire life and promising career ahead of her. Robert and Catherine had been at the hospital when Emma passed, holding their daughter's hands and telling her how much they loved her, how proud they were of the person she had become, and how her kindness and compassion had made the world better. The grief that followed Emma's death had been overwhelming for both Robert and Catherine. Losing a child is a pain that defies description, a violation of the natural order that leaves parents feeling untethered from everything they believed about how life should unfold. Catherine, who had spent her career caring for sick children, found herself unable to return to work in pediatrics because every child she saw reminded her of the daughter she had lost. Robert, who had always found purpose and meaning in teaching, discovered that standing in front of his students and pretending to be okay when his heart was shattered felt impossible. They had both taken extended leave from their jobs, trying to navigate grief that seemed too large to survive, leaning on each other as they worked through pain that came in waves so powerful they sometimes felt like they might drown. Catherine had eventually returned to work, transitioning to a different area of nursing that did not involve children, finding that staying busy and helping others provided some relief from the constant ache of Emma's absence. Robert had also returned to teaching, discovering that his students' energy and questions gave him moments of purpose that helped him continue functioning when everything felt meaningless. But the grief was always there, a constant companion that colored every experience and made joy feel guilty and happiness feel like betrayal of Emma's memory. Robert and Catherine had supported each other through the worst of it, attending grief counseling together, joining a support group for parents who had lost children, and slowly learning how to live in a world that no longer contained their daughter while honoring her memory and the love they would carry for her forever. 2 years after Emma's death, Catherine began experiencing symptoms that she initially dismissed as stress and grief-related fatigue. She was tired all the time, had difficulty concentrating, and felt physically weak in ways that seemed disproportionate to her activity level. When the symptoms persisted and worsened, Robert had insisted she see a doctor, worried that grief was affecting her physical health in ways that needed medical attention. The diagnosis had been devastating. Catherine had stage 4 pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and difficult to treat forms of the disease. The cancer had already metastasized to her liver and lungs by the time it was discovered, and the oncologist had been honest about the prognosis. With aggressive treatment, Catherine might have 6 months to a year. Without treatment, she likely had only weeks. Robert had been shattered by this news, unable to comprehend that after losing Emma, he might also lose Catherine, the love of his life and his partner in navigating the grief of their daughter's death. Catherine had been remarkably calm when receiving the diagnosis, telling Robert that she was not afraid of dying, that she had lived a good life filled with love, and that the thought of being reunited with Emma brought her comfort rather than fear. She had chosen to undergo limited treatment, focused on quality of life, rather than aggressive interventions that would make her final months miserable. And she had made Robert promise that he would find ways to continue living after she was gone, that he would honor both her and Emma by staying connected to the world and the people who loved him. During Catherine's final months, she and Robert had talked extensively about their life together, about Emma and the joy she had brought them, about the memories they cherished and the love that would continue even after death. Catherine had made Robert promise several specific things. She wanted him to stay close to his sister Margaret and her family, to not isolate himself in grief. She wanted him to continue teaching, because she knew how much his students needed him, and how much he needed the purpose that work provided. She wanted him to find moments of joy without feeling guilty, to laugh without believing that laughter betrayed her memory or Emma's. And in a conversation that Robert would remember for the rest of his life, Catherine had made him promise something that had seemed trivial at the time, but that she insisted was important. She wanted Robert to do something fun and unexpected, something that would force him to engage with life in a way that felt different from the grief and routine that had defined the years since Emma's death. Catherine had been a faithful viewer of Family Feud for decades, watching episodes during her lunch breaks at the hospital and in the evenings at home with Robert. She loved Steve Harvey's humor and warmth, and she always said that the show reminded her that despite all the pain in the world, families still found ways to support each other and share joy. In one of their final conversations, Catherine had told Robert that she wanted him to apply to be on Family Feud, to gather his family and friends, and have an experience that would create new memories, and remind him that life still offered moments worth living for. Robert had promised he would, holding Catherine's hand and agreeing even though the idea of being on a game show felt absurd when his wife was dying. Catherine had passed away peacefully at home with Robert beside her, 8 months after her diagnosis. She had slipped away in her sleep, and Robert had held her hand knowing that she was no longer in pain, that she was at peace, and that in whatever came after death, she was with Emma again. The grief of losing Catherine had been different from the grief of losing Emma, but equally profound. Robert had lost his daughter, and then his wife, the two people who had been the foundation of his existence, and he found himself at 61 years old completely alone in ways he had never anticipated or prepared for. His sister Margaret and her husband Carl had moved Robert into their guest room for several months, refusing to let him isolate himself, providing companionship and support as he navigated the early stages of grief, and learned how to function without the woman he had loved for nearly 4 decades. 1 year after Catherine's death, Robert remembered the promise he had made to her about applying for Family Feud. His initial instinct was to dismiss it as something said in a moment of emotion that did not need to be honored, but the more he thought about it, the more he understood why Catherine had asked him to do it. She had known that Robert's tendency would be to withdraw from life, to go through the motions without truly engaging, and she had wanted to give him a specific task that would require him to be vulnerable, to be present, and to create an experience that honored her memory by showing that he was still capable of living rather than merely existing. Robert had contacted his sister Margaret, his nephew David, and his neighbor Helen, explaining Catherine's request and asking if they would be willing to apply as a family unit. All of them had immediately agreed, understanding that this was about more than a game show, that it was about honoring Catherine's final wish and supporting Robert in taking a step toward re-engagement with life. As Steve Harvey began the game with his characteristic energy and warmth, the Peterson family played competently. Robert answered questions with intelligence and occasional flashes of humor, drawing on his years of teaching experience to think strategically about survey responses. Steve noticed that despite Robert's engagement with the game, there was a sadness in his eyes that suggested loss and pain, a quality that made Steve pay closer attention even though he could not articulate exactly why. During a commercial break, Steve approached Robert and made conversation, asking how long he had been teaching and whether he was enjoying the Family Feud experience. Robert smiled genuinely and said that he was having more fun than he had expected, that being there meant something special to him, and that someone very important to him had wanted him to have this experience. Steve nodded encouragingly, but sensed there was a deeper story that Robert was not yet ready to share. The moment that changed everything came during the third round of the game. The question appeared on the board asking contestants to name something you would want to tell someone you love one more time. Robert buzzed in first, and without hesitation said, "I am proud of you and I love you," his voice catching with emotion as he spoke. The answer was on the board as the number one response, and the audience applauded enthusiastically, but Steve paused. Something about the specificity of Robert's answer, the raw emotion barely contained in his voice, the way he had to pause and collect himself after speaking, made Steve look at him with concern and curiosity. Steve set his cards down and said gently, "Robert, that sounded like it came from a very personal place. Is there someone specific you wish you could say those words to one more time?" The studio fell quiet as everyone waited to see if Robert would answer. Robert stood very still for a long moment, and everyone could see him wrestling with whether to keep his grief private or to honor the truth of why he was standing on that stage. Finally, he looked directly at Steve and said quietly, "My daughter Emma and my wife Catherine. They both died in the last 3 years, and I would give anything to tell them one more time how proud I was of them and how much I loved them." Steve's expression immediately shifted from curious to devastated. He took a step toward Robert, his professional demeanor completely abandoned as he processed what he had just heard. "Robert," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so profoundly sorry. Losing both your daughter and your wife, that is heartbreak I cannot even imagine." Robert nodded, tears forming in his eyes despite his efforts to maintain composure. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey," he said simply. But Steve was not done, sensing that there was more to Robert's story that needed to be heard and honored. He asked Robert if he was willing to share more about Emma and Catherine, understanding instinctively that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone who is grieving is the opportunity to talk about the people they have lost, to keep their memory alive through stories and remembrance. Robert took a deep breath, looked at his sister Margaret, who nodded encouragement, and made the decision to tell the truth about why he was really on that stage. Over the next several minutes, standing on the Family Feud stage with cameras rolling and an audience listening in rapt attention, Robert described his daughter Emma, the brilliant and compassionate young doctor who had dedicated her life to caring for children with cancer, who had died at 29 in a car accident after losing a patient and working herself to exhaustion. He talked about the grief that he and Catherine had endured after losing Emma, the way they had supported each other through the worst pain imaginable, and how they had slowly learned to continue living while honoring Emma's memory. Then Robert described losing Catherine to cancer just 2 years after Emma's death, watching his wife of 38 years slip away while dealing with grief, that was compounded by the loss of their only child. He explained that Catherine had made him promise to apply for Family Feud, that being on the show was about honoring her final wish and proving to himself that he could still engage with life, even though the two people he loved most in the world were gone. By the time Robert finished speaking, there was not a dry eye in the studio. Steve Harvey stood with tears streaming down his face, making no effort to hide his emotional response to Robert's story. The audience was crying openly, the crew members were wiping their eyes, and everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment of raw honesty and profound grief that transcended entertainment and touched something fundamental about love and loss. Steve walked over to Robert and pulled him into a genuine embrace, holding him for a long moment while both men cried. When Steve finally stepped back, he looked directly into the cameras and said something that would resonate with millions of viewers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice shaking, "this is what courage looks like. This man lost his daughter and his wife, the two people who were his whole world, and he is standing here honoring a promise he made to keep living, to keep showing up, to keep finding reasons to engage with life even when life has taken everything that mattered most." Steve turned back to Robert and asked him to tell everyone more about Emma and Catherine, to share what made them special, to give voice to the love that continued even after death. Robert described Emma's passion for helping children, her gentle bedside manner that had comforted countless families facing the worst moments of their lives, her brilliant mind and kind heart that had made her an exceptional doctor and an even more exceptional person. He talked about finding Emma's journal after her death and reading entry after entry about patients she had cared for, families she had supported, and the privilege she felt in being part of people's healing journeys, even when healing meant managing pain rather than curing disease. He described how Emma's colleagues had told him that she had been one of the most gifted and compassionate residents they had ever worked with, that she had a future as bright as any they had seen, and that losing her had devastated not just her family, but the entire medical community that had recognized her extraordinary gifts. Robert then spoke about Catherine, his wife of 38 years, who had been his best friend and partner through every challenge life presented. He described her dedication to nursing, her gentle strength that had helped countless families navigate medical crises, her unwavering faith that had sustained them both through Emma's death, and her grace in facing her own terminal diagnosis with courage and acceptance rather than bitterness or fear. He talked about Catherine's final months, the conversations they had about their life together, the memories they revisited, and the promises she had extracted from him about continuing to live fully even after she was gone. He explained that sitting on the Family Feud stage was his way of keeping that promise, of proving that he could still find moments of engagement and maybe even joy while honoring the memory of the two women who had given his life meaning and purpose. Steve listened to every word, asking questions that showed genuine interest in understanding who Emma and Catherine had been as people rather than simply acknowledging that they had died. He asked about Emma's favorite things, her personality quirks, the dreams she had for her future. He asked about Catherine's nursing career, the qualities that had made her such a dedicated caregiver, the wisdom she had shared during her final conversations with Robert. He created space for Robert to talk about his loved ones in ways that celebrated their lives rather than focusing solely on their deaths, understanding that this was what people who are grieving often need most desperately: the opportunity to remember out loud and to share the people they have lost with others who are willing to truly listen. If this story has touched your heart, if Robert's courage in honoring his promises to Catherine has reminded you of the power of love that transcends death, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to remember that even after devastating loss, keeping the promises we make to those we love gives us purpose and direction when everything else feels meaningless. The story of Robert Peterson shows us that grief is the price we pay for love, that carrying forward the wishes of those who have died honors their memory, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is continue living when our reason for living is gone, finding new purposes and creating new memories while never forgetting the people who shaped us and loved us unconditionally.